I'm Aisha. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
I'd like to touch on some issues that have been partly mentioned, but that haven't really been talked about very much. And let me start with a quote. I seem to be addicted to quotes. I hope you can hear me from this all right. The quote was made a few years ago about the entire continent of Latin America. And it went something like this. I'm going to read it as it was originally written, and then I'm going to juxtapose the word Dominican Republic instead. Latin America has grown used to living in the backyard of the United States. For decades, it's been a country and a region where the U.S. government meddled in local politics, fought communists, and promoted its business interests. If we juxtapose that and say the Dominican Republic has grown used to living in the backyard of the United States, for decades it's been a country where the U.S. government has meddled in local politics, fought communists, and promoted its business interests. Part of what is the Dominican Republic is in its history. And that is a history both in the shadow of the United States and in the shadow of Cuba, and what the message of Cuba meant for the Caribbean and what the message of Cuba meant in terms of U.S.-Latin American relations and U.S.-Caribbean relations. The Dominican Republic is also three countries. It's a country for the tourists that you saw in the video, and that's a very special enclave, elite country. It's a country for the 5 to 10% of Dominicans who perhaps get anywhere from 50 to 80% of the major riches and GDP in the country. And it's a country where poor Dominicans live, and in fact, one could maybe even say a fourth country where hundreds of thousands of Haitians live. And so there are many Dominican republics. And one of the challenges of the Dominican Republic, obviously, is to deal with all of those countries in actually one territory. In looking at a general book on Latin American politics and what they had to say about the Dominican Republic, I was struck that one of the first things that was mentioned was racial strife. Not too much was mentioned about the country because it was a very quick vignette, but one of the things was racial strife. The Dominican Republic is largely a mulatto or mixed society. Okay. Nevertheless, race plays a tremendous role because of history and because of socioeconomic dynamics that are still very significant and important in the country today. Despite a lot of progress, there's still social discrimination because of race and color of one's skin, someone that's darker as opposed to someone that's lighter. And the majority of the elite in the country, of course, are lighter. If any of you have been able to visit the Dominican Republic and have seen the batés, where a lot of the Haitian sugarcane workers have lived in the past and continue to live at some point, not too long ago, a group of students from a South Florida university went there. They were nursing students. And as the students came back, they went as part of a kind of a work-study tour and to learn about other countries. And as they came back, one of the students said that I felt that I was living in a world with modern-day slavery. And of course, she was speaking about the conditions of the workers, the Haitian workers that were living in the Bâtés. There are some thousands of Haitian immigrants that are in the Dominican Republic, and this is something that is very integral to what will happen politically and socially in the country. It's integral to its history. This book also mentioned something else in terms of the Dominican Republic, which I wouldn't have thought to mention, and that was women's rights. The Dominican Republic has been extremely progressive in terms of laws. It has signed and ratified conventions on all forms of discrimination against women, the optional protocols. It's signed all the human rights legislation. Nevertheless, with that having been said, a lot of the workers in the free trade zones are women. A lot of those workers have limited labor rights. And in the Dominican Republic, we also find that a large number of the households are headed by women who don't have the same degree of opportunities of men in that society, despite the tremendously progressive labor legislation, human rights and women's rights legislation that is on the books. Other issues that we've talked about here this morning have to do with social and economic progress or the lack thereof. It's already been mentioned that there's a great degree of corruption. We have perhaps partly mentioned the idea that there's also political corruption, political fraud. And in a sense, underneath this picture that looks somewhat rosy, there's a darker side. And that darker side has to do with this increasing corruption and the role of politics in the society. Economic progress has been fitful. The recession, if you will, of 2000, 2001 to 2004, but then the significant growth since that makes us ask, what will the future trajectory be? Will that future trajectory continue with that growth? And having said that about the growth, part of the problem of the model that we're looking at today, the model of neoliberalism, Washington consensus, the emphasis on growth, although Ambassador Frechette was very correct in talking about the Millennium Challenge and the importance of reducing poverty. But part of the problem with the model that we've been looking at is that it emphasizes the macro growth model, which is not balanced out by the importance of social economic equality. And that, as has been partly mentioned, is a major issue in the Dominican Republic, tremendous inequality. Another little elephant in the room, if we can say that, has to do with the history with the United States. The Dominican Republic has had limited moments, in my opinion, of true, deep democracy. That one of the few elections that were free and very, very popular by a populist, if we will, was that by Juan Bosch in December of 1963. For various reasons, those elections led to greater instability in the country, one of which was because of a constitution that was passed in 1963, which introduced a whole series of reforms: land reform, separation of church and state, civilian control over the military, issues that threatened an oligarchy that remains entrenched in the Dominican Republic today. We know that ultimately this led to either a revolution or a civil war, whichever your preference may be, and that ultimately in April of 1965, the United States sent in some 200,000 troops in order to help stabilize what was then feared by President Johnson would be a communist takeover, or communist stylistic government, which was that of Juan Bosch. So we have another interesting legacy, if you want, a shadow of Cuba, the fear of another Cuba, but also the role of the United States in both trying to promote democracy and not promoting democracy at the same time in terms of its policy. That intervention and that history of intervention is very significant to the country and what it means to be a Dominican. A colleague of mine wrote a book on the Dominican Republic which was subtitled Unsovereign Nation. And one of the themes that we find in Latin America today, and one of the reasons for the changes, is this tremendous emphasis on sovereignty, and sovereignty in relation to what some people have called U.S. hegemony. I'd like to read one more quote to shift gears, and that has to do with the challenge of change. I think that what's happening in Latin America, what's happening, I think will happen in the Dominican Republic, because I'm not sure it's there yet. It seems somewhat behind the times in some respects, that the change is tied up with the rise of neopopulism and populist leaders, bottom-up demands for democratic changes, mass politics, backlash against some ruling elites that are entrenched in a number of countries in the region, and with that as well, anti-market, anti-globalization, anti-neoliberal forces. That having been said, I think that the majority of the people in the region do want the market, do want capitalism, because I agree with Ambassador Frechette. They want jobs, and they want to improve their livelihoods. However, the model that they have been used to because of the conditions within the individual countries, including the Dominican Republic, have not favored the majority of the people that are poor and that the inequality that they have to deal with. This particular quote partly addresses the political dynamic of it. It goes like this: Latin American voters are aggrieved, impatient, eager to vote for new candidates who offer a break with the past and who promise a way out of the dire present. Well, we could say that about the Dominican Republic. That has been a theme in the recent elections, maybe upcoming elections again, in part because you don't have much political choice. Two fairly conservative political parties have dominated the political scene over the last several decades and have not really provided the change that the country has needed. One of the policies that were followed in the country is that of President Fernandez, who talked about liberalism with a human face, in trying to deal with the negative forces that are related to neoliberalism or to some of the market and globalization tensions that we have. In 2004, various journals, for example, Foreign Policy often does this. They have a failed states index, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, and Freedom House also has an index that they use to judge things such as political rights and civil liberties. On these indices, in 2003, 2004, the Dominican Republic did not do very well, in part because of corruption, lack of transparency in the political arena. Also on the failed state index in that year, the Dominican Republic ranked 19 out of a whole range of other countries that were mostly African countries. We're very used to talking about Africa as the lost continent. Well, a few years ago in Foreign Policy, there was also an article by Moises Naim who called Latin America the lost continent for some interesting reasons that we probably don't have time to go into. But on that indice, Haiti was number 10, Colombia was 14, and the Dominican Republic was 19. What is interesting about that is a discussion of what it means to be a failed state. One of the ways that a society can fail and that a state can fail is obviously by terrorism, by civil war, by violence, by racial hatred. The society, the state disintegrates. There's another way that a society and a state can fail, and that is by slow, drip by drip, inappropriate or insufficient development, and also by a stifling of true democracy and by a stifling of real socioeconomic equality in the society. I think that's the threat. That's a danger that one can see that may be in the future of the Dominican Republic unless some significant changes are made, unless these 3 or 4 countries that make up the Dominican Republic can somehow reconcile themselves. Is it likely? I certainly hope so. But this emphasis on tourism, which is very significant because the society has to live, it has continued to create very much of an enclave type society. And there's tremendous dangers in that because you have people that see how the other half lives. They see this anyway in relation to their own oligarchy. But when they see this in relation to some degree that they are allowed access to the very rich, and some even not so rich, but to them very rich-looking tourists in some of the special areas of the country that are completely walled off, guarded, I mean, higher than Homeland Security standards, perhaps. And so that is something that is potentially extremely dangerous when we talk about this thing about failed states. I have to say that I'm not particularly a fan of the failed state model, but I think sometimes it's important to look. And one of the things that this may address would be this issue of rising expectations and frustrations. In a sense, we could argue that the Dominican Republic attempted major reform decades ago. It attempted revolutionary change that was necessary to equalize forces in the society that were preventing it from developing and moving forward. Those forces were stifled. Those forces have never since actually come to the fore again. Will they? Can they? I don't know. Latin America is a different place today. The United States is different. The world is different. There's a whole range of changes about Latin America that I won't have time to get into that one can look at that may cause us to answer that question in a different way. But I do think that once these reformist and revolutionary forces are stifled, they have a way of wanting out one way or another. Thank you very much.